Hi everyone! So welcome to the CRX in Kansas webinar series on researching the far-right methods and ethics. My name is Ulrike Gagnon. I am an assistant professor at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada. I am also affiliated with the Center for Research on Extremism, so CRX, based at the University of Oslo, and I am a member of the Executive Committee of Kansas, so the Canadian Network for Research on Security, Extremism and Society. So this webinar series aims to facilitate a discussion on the ethical, methodological, political, personal, practical, and professional challenges involved in researching violent extremism and terrorism. These webinars are offered on the third Thursday of every month. So today's webinar will be featuring Dr. Elizabeth Pearson. So she is a senior lecturer in criminology and program lead for the Master Terrorism and Counterterrorism Studies course at University of London. Her research interests are in gender, extremism, and counter-extremism. And Liz most recent books, Extreme Britain, Gender, Masculinity, and Radicalization, was published with the Hurst and Oxford University Press in 2023. In today's talk, Liz will explore the challenges of using an empathetic methodology when interviewing far-right extremists during semi-ethnographic fieldwork in the UK. So she will address the ethical, moral, emotional, and practical difficulties of conducting close-up research with extremists, particularly as a woman academic. So Liz will present during about 25 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any question, please feel free to write them down using the Q&A button. Do not use the chat function. It will be easier that way for me to moderate the question at the end. So please feel free to write down your question at any time during the webinar, but we will address them at the end. So that's all for me. I will now give the mic to Liz.
Oh, thanks very much for that introduction. I'm just going to share my slides and I will do give me a shout if my web connection drops off. It hasn't been very well behaved today. And thank you for inviting me to come and take part in this webinar series. And thank you to everybody who's come along today as well. So I'm going to talk to the topic of, is it okay to talk to extremists? Navigating gender and avoiding legitimization in ethnography with the far right. And as Audrey said, this is actually a chapter in the book Extreme Britain, where I go into quite a lot of detail. So for anyone who's more interested at the end of this, which hopefully you will be, then that's the place to go and have a look for more. And essentially, when I was doing the research for that book, it was my PhD project. And I was not just talking to the far right, but in this webinar, I am really focusing on conversations with the anti-Islam far right. So on this slide, you'll see three of the kinds of key leaders that I spoke to. And then I also spoke to grassroots activists who were going to their demos, who were part of For Britain, which doesn't exist anymore. That's Anne-Marie Waters there. Jada Franson of Britain First, she left Britain First amid accusations of domestic violence and abuse from its leader, Paul Golding. And Tommy Robinson is probably the most recognisable character of that trio. And his most recent success, as far as he's concerned, was the Unite the Kingdom rally, which took place last month in London. And he has been in court this week, actually, on terrorism charges, and the verdict has been delayed while he makes a visit to Israel. So I talked to more far-right activists than Islamists, but I did also speak to Anjem Choudhury and a few of his followers, leader of the band, Al-Muhajiroon, and he is in prison at the moment on terrorism charges. And this whole book was about gender and in this talk, really, I'm going to talk about the role of empathy and the difficulty of using empathy as a methodology. And I think the difficulty of talking to the far right now. Things have changed since I did this research, which was before COVID. I did speak to a few people for the book subsequently, but mostly I stopped the research relationships, those text and email and conversations after I finished this research. And there are increasing fears about the legitimization, the normalization, and mainstreaming of the far right at a time where radical right populism is growing in power across Europe, but globally, really. And probably the best evidence of this was not just the size of the crowds that Tommy Robinson had at his last Unite the Kingdom protest, but the presence of Elon Musk, who gave an address to the crowds and who Tommy Robinson revealed had actually been paying for his for help for his court case this week. So Tommy Robinson will have been delighted to now be connected to some of the richest and most powerful people on the planet. So, is the role of empathy still relevant here? Is it still appropriate? And that's what I want to talk about. So, my question when I was talking to both the far right and Islamist actors was really about the role of gender in extremism. And I'm going to talk about the challenges of doing the research and the ethics of that in the first place. And I'm going to talk about the challenges of being, the more practical challenges of being a woman for the sort of last part of this presentation. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So I was coming to this subject really from a gender perspective. I was engaging very much with feminist methodologies. I was based in war studies at King's College London, which is a hub of terrorism studies, particularly. So as a researcher, I was somebody who kind of had a slightly uneasy integration of gender methods and feminist theories, as well as terrorism studies, itself. So I was really determined to get interviews with people involved in the far right because partly I used to be a journalist and this was always what I did. I interviewed people. And also because in terrorism studies, there is a real primary sources, interviews with subjects are almost like the holy grail within terrorism studies. And terrorism studies authors, and I don't know how many people here come from that discipline, I'm thinking maybe not so many, but terrorism studies authors really prioritize empathy. But it's not really about an ethic of care. It is really about the production of data, about getting subjects to talk and getting this primary source material. So, Andrew Silk, John Horgan, Adam Dolnick all talk about empathy, but it's very much about, getting interviews and getting those transcripts. Whereas when you look at feminist scholars who discuss using empathy as a method, it is much more about, it's about a means to illuminate a field. So Christine Sylvester talks about using empathy as a method in order to really produce the kind of subjectivity moving interview. So that means that you enter into this empathetic relationship with the subject in order not to be static, but this is dynamic. You expect as the researcher to be changed by this, which is clearly slightly problematic when the research group that you're thinking of talking to have very problematic views and are causing harm in different ways. And Summers, again articulates this as feminist empathy as method is about revealing the previously excluded subjects and suppressed subjectivities into theories of action. And this is really about thinking about women as those excluded subjects and people of colour. And it's not about engaging with people whose marginalisation is really about their own activities that have produced that marginalisation. So this ethic of care goes beyond that kind of researcher care that we need to have in the ethical approval process of our universities and into something which is a bit more about an exchange of ideas, about really listening and putting yourself into their shoes, into their skin, to recognize their humanity and how they are like us. So Joel Busher, who's done a lot of work on the English Defence League when that was active, 10 years ago, talks about this principle of non-dehumanization. And Harmony Toros has also discussed this. And this is as an antidote to the frequent demonization and dehumanization of stigmatized groups, including extreme actors. Now, I think for me as a researcher, I felt much more comfortable with this idea talking to Islamist subjects because, having read all the literature, I went into this space thinking, oh, the Islamist subjects are jihadists because they have experienced exclusion from mainstream society, Islamophobia, discrimination, racism. And I felt comfortable with that as a researcher, not with that background, but with, talking to them about this. And actually, they said, how patronizing of you. This is condescending. And actually, it's not because of white people's racism that we are, supportive of Islamism. It's because we believe in it, because we believe in God, and this is the way that we believe in it. So, take yourself out of that picture as a white person, which was a surprise to me. And I had a very different idea about the far right because my positionality, and of course, as a researcher, I was very conscious to write and reflect, not too much because this project was not about me, but to recognize my own positionality in going into this space. And of course, I was looking at masculinities, and there's quite a wide literature on the ways that criminology has used masculinity studies to really demonize the most marginalized groups of men. So men who are engaged with the criminal justice systems, and they are often working class men from marginalized ethnic groups, but also, white working class men. So all of these approaches were, in my mind. And I wanted to use this approach because feminist empathetic methodologies are also about destabilizing some of those structures of power. And they're about destabilizing that particular structure of power, which is about men's power, masculinism, hypermasculinity, militarism associated with fascism, with far right groups, and really using feminist approaches to do the opposite of what those groups want to do, which is not to listen, to foster polarization, and to, they are anti-feminist, they are anti-gender, and they are anti-liberal groups. So in this context, that was a deliberate choice also as a kind of subversive, destabilizing approach. And of course, I recognized that I was going to have to reveal something of myself in this image. This is a kind of two heads on this equal kind of level. Now, I didn't go into this space as an equal. I went there with lots of power in some ways and lots of vulnerabilities in other ways. But I was ready for that reciprocal relationship, even if the participants did not want to have a reciprocal relationship with me. I was there to listen, and I was there to exercise this care, which could be quite problematic. And indeed, quite a few of the people that I spoke to said to me, what, this is the first time I've ever sat down and talked to someone like you, and I'm finding it really weird. And they would get angry with me and they would say, well, how come you seem to understand, but you don't agree? And I have to say, well, I've got different sets of values. I don't understand the situation in the same way. And they got very frustrated, some of them, by this. And others, said to me, this is really weird. You're like a brick wall. You are completely impervious to my arguments. So it was quite a challenging way in. And it could also potentially be quite problematic. So there is a strong voice in the field at the moment that has developed that asks us to really think not just about our position, but about our race as white researchers doing research with white supremacists and with white actors who are causing harm to people of color. And, Joe Raza had talked about this subsequent to my doing the research, but, makes a really important point. Terrorism studies particularly is really implicated in some of the worst state abuses when it comes to thinking about terrorism and power. And it has a very poor track record of thinking about race and positionality in terms of the work that researchers have done. And there is a problem if you go into this space as a white researcher, that empathy is really just a way, or becomes a way, despite your best intentions, of upholding white supremacist methods in the social sciences. Particularly at a time when, as many authors have pointed out, the extreme is mainstream in many ways, whether that's clothes, symbology, social media platforms, or, voting patterns. So this was a huge concern to me that, as researchers, we all want to do no harm. And how would I, as a white researcher in this space, using an empathetic methodology, do no harm? Was I going to let people off the hook by, projecting and some of their grievances as legitimate? Am I really separate from the community that I am researching, given that we share structures of racial power? And this is something that, perhaps is easier to make right in the writing about it and the analysis afterwards, once you've made that decision that you are going to go and that you think that the activists have a story to tell which adds something to our understanding of the anti-Islam far right, or indeed the far right more broadly. Because at some of these marches, there were swastikas, there was anti-Semitism, there was much broader racism. So these were kind of merged kind of demonstrations very often. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that, if you're doing intersectional work, as I was trying to do, then class becomes really important. And actually, this was one thing that I really did not share with the researchers, with the research participants. Joel Busher said that when he was doing his research, he almost had a kind of form of culture shock because he was going into groups of people where he did not share norms. He didn't share anything. That's not entirely true, I think, in my case, but certainly I was not regarded as sharing very much. And of course, they are going to reject the idea that we shared white structures of power. They reject the idea they are racist. They reject that they have any power as white people at all, and were really mobilizing around the idea of being second-class citizens. But at the same time, in British society, it is also true to say that that it is commonplace to mock, revile a white working class underclass. Much of the white working class in this country is very anti-racist and pushes back. But this is an image from Little Britain, which was this is a character called Vicky Pollard. So this was a kind of chav character, and chav is like an offensive term to describe this kind of underclass. So there is a lot of stigma associated with sections of the far right. And in fact, when we're discussing the backgrounds of those actors that I was talking to, a good half of them would talk to me about immigration backgrounds in their own families. So they had predominantly Irish heritage. It's quite important that those and Irish incredibly stigmatized when they arrived in the UK to begin with in the 50s and 60s. And the places that they immigrated to have been succeeded by fresher waves of immigration. And this was partly contributed to their kind of activism. But also there were research participants who they had family members who were people of color, whether they had married into their family or they were in their sort of, their grandparents or even parents. And of course, they use this as a kind of justification of their own lack of racism. They push back on that racist label by saying, oh, yeah, but how can I be racist? Because, my grandma comes from Jamaica. And then, of course, this kind of distancing of those of their family member from wider issues that they regarded in that community. So that this is not to say that I did not, consider my own whiteness in this research, but that class was also a really important kind of axis of identity around which to do this work as well. So how did I avoid the problem of doing more harm with empathy than good? I think Joel Busher says, this is really about trying to outweigh the bad that we may do with the goods. And I think it's really hard for me to judge. I think it's hard for any of us to judge the what our work does once it hits the world, how it will be used and how other people will respond to it. But I did use transcript. Some people don't use transcript from their interviews. They make sort of case study. They sum up what their respondents say rather than using transcript. But I tried to be quite careful to use transcript in which the anti-Islam sentiment was not the most apparent. I almost took it as read that we can assume the racist intentions of the people I'm talking to. So I'm interested in the other things, in their lives, their relationships, around this. And of course, they were sharing things with me that were, sometimes I did have genuine empathy for. I use this reflexive approach, and I'm conscious to really kind of show that I know that, the first thing is to be educated on these arguments and on the potential perils, and then to try to use your critical framing and your analysis, which, I don't know if I succeed in the book, but I certainly tried to do that. So I'm going to move on from talking about this, and, I'm interested in your comments and thoughts about this when we move to the Q&A. But I would just spend the last 5 minutes kind of reflecting on my own safety and the harms that were possible to me, not just the harms that I potentially might be doing in this space. Because I was going to, I was meeting people one-to-one, I was going to their homes, I was meeting them in cafes, I was chatting to them online. I was also going to really dynamic events where I couldn't predict or control the circumstances, far right street demonstrations of the kind that I went to. They are highly densely populated. There is the potential to be kettled by the police, to be hemmed in. There is the potential for clashes between protesters or with counter protesters. There is the potential to be abused, and you cannot control a lot of what is happening here. And no one can predict what will happen at these events. So you are essentially kind of putting yourself into a space where you might come to harm, and on people might harm you in various different ways, or you're vulnerable in various different ways. And I would characterize those as being physical, sexual, and also online trolling and abuse. I'm not going to say that my specific case is universal. Every individual woman researcher will have individual kinds of issues in the field, and particularly for researchers of colour. And it is possible to do this work as a researcher of colour, and it has been done. But some of these harms I know are shared. And, Audrey, you yourself have kind of talked to researchers about some of these harms. And so, physical harms, or even just physical contact, you can't control who's going to touch you, who's going to grab you, who will hug you, shake your hand, put their hat on your head, pull you around. All of this happened. Who is going to shout in your face abuse or, abuse you online? Who is going to sexually proposition you or sexually abuse you? And, all of this happens and it's out of your control. You'll be photographed. You don't know how that photograph will be used. You might be filmed by the press. You don't know how that is going to be used, because once you're present in that space, people might make assumptions about your attitude and your sympathies rather than empathy for this group. I said I was trying to exercise care. That comes at a cost. You're going to listen to some things that you really don't agree with, and you are not going to be able to express your disagreement because you don't want to put yourself further at risk. And at the end of the day, you do want to maintain the relationship and the rapport, to maintain the data and to get the interview. As transactional as that sounds, that's what you're there for, is to get some information to do the research. And you're going to be listening to people sometimes pouring their heart out to you when you've spoken to them several times, telling you about things that you genuinely feel for them, domestic violence, sexual abuse, sexual assaults. So they are sharing things, and they have an expectation that when they've shared that with you and they've made themselves vulnerable, that you are going to be invested in them, and in ways that you are not always. They might come to you for help that you can't give. And of course, you always carry the risk that you are going to be stigmatized by that. And you are going to get that revulsion, that affect that goes with that kind of underclass of chav, and that will stick to you too. And indeed it did. In one instance, I sought to correct a narrative. I was at a demo, far right respondent I had been talking to got hit by a brick, thrown actually by a far left demonstrator. It was reported in the press as being far right that had thrown the brick. I mean, the far right do plenty of harm, but in this case, they hadn't thrown that brick. And when I sought, as a former journalist and a King's researcher and a white person with white privilege, to correct that narrative, the journalist pushed back. And the kind of clear assumption was, if you're pushing back on this, you must be far right. And that was the first and last time I ever did that. And I felt my white privilege disappearing. I don't know if that would have been better if I'd been a man, but I was kind of, this was a revelation to me. And I had a moment of getting that kind of stigma. And friends would say to me, "How can you hang out with these people? I saw some images of that demo on the news and like they just look so awful." And to be honest, after about the first demo, they didn't look awful to me anymore, because I was spending more time with people, talking to them, and I was changing, and that is what I expected as a result of my research. But what is the reality of that change? I'm not radicalizing. I don't agree with them. They all know I don't agree with them. But something is shifting for me. I'm on a journey and I've got an insight that other people don't have. And all of this made my, all of this is emotional work that you're carrying with you in the field. And you only hope that you're doing good and that your work will be well received and will be meaningful. And that's by no means a given. So I'm going to kind of finish here because I think I've been talking long enough. But my summary is really to say that I did to the best of my abilities, based on the work of my colleagues and all the great people that have gone before me, to do this work in an ethical way, to protect myself and to ensure that I did no harm either with my respondents or in society more broadly. But I do believe, I think it's probably clear that even and perhaps possibly more than ever at this really dangerous time, that we need to engage. And that engagement is a way of challenging the masculinism of this space. So I'm really interested in your thoughts and questions as researchers as well here. And thank you very much for the time. And the book is out, I should say, in paperback next year, if people are interested in reading it for a cheaper price than it's on with at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was an amazing presentation. And as we know that there are debates in the field about whether it is okay or not to talk to extremists in the context of research. So I'm really glad that you shared your perspective with us today, in particular because I know that there's a lot of PhD students that are watching this webinar at the moment who are conducting interviews, who are doing close-up research with right-wing extremists at the moment. So it's nice for them to have to be able to ask their question and to discuss with you on this very important topic. I see that we already have questions in the Q&A, so we will start right away. So there's a first question by Alexander Price asking, well, first, hi Liz, thank you so much for this valuable and timely talk. My question for you concerned the practical challenges of obtaining permission from law enforcement and from subject to conduct interviews with offenders in prison. What are the concerns of the authorities? What kind of a time frame can you expect the permission process to take? And what motivates subjects to speak with researchers?
Okay, so this is an interesting question because when I started doing this research, I'm going to talk to offenders in prison on terrorism charges, and I could not get permission. So everybody that I spoke to, I made my own contact with, essentially. I didn't have gatekeepers, and it took me a long time to get any interviews. And for offenders in prison, the motivation, from what I know from my criminology colleagues, is that they are bored. They want to get their story out there. They want to use you as a mouthpiece, the same as anybody speaking to us in this space would want to do. So you need to be really careful and be cognizant of what other people's agenda is and the role that they might see you playing for them, rather than having your own agenda. So I don't know how easy it is in other contexts to get those permissions. The Ministry of Justice in the UK, I think, tends to use experienced researchers for this, and not to have very many of them because they don't want to have a lot of researchers in those prison systems. And I don't know where you're based, Alexander, but in the UK, often people are in these kind of segregation units where they're kept apart from the wider prison population. So this wasn't something, actually, I really hoped, because it would have been easier for someone to say, here you go, you can talk to these people. But I did not have that. I was having to make my own contacts by going to demos, by sending emails, by picking up the phone and constantly ringing. Believe it or not, I was just constantly ringing the Britain First kind of team to say, I want to speak to you, which sounds a bit bizarre, really, but it took a long time, I'll be honest.
Thank you. So we have two questions that are very similar, so I'm going to combine them together. So the first is, should we consider pretending that we agree with the subject's extremist views to extract more data from them? And the second one is, when communicating with far-right actors, what do you think of the ethics and utility of presenting yourself as a more centrist rather than admitting to being to the left? So it's about deception. And
Yeah. Well, I think there's deception and then there's something less than deception, which is just maybe keeping your personal opinions a bit more to yourself. I mean, for me, it was a little bit difficult to have any form of deception because at that point in time, so I used to work for the BBC, and the far right obviously do not like the BBC. So I was not a famous talent with the BBC, but I did have some kind of small public profile. As in, if you Googled my name back then, a lot of it seems to have gone now, you would see that I used to be a reporter. I worked for Women's Hour, I'd worked for like You and Yours. So it was pointless to pretend really that I had kind of any real sympathies with this at all. And so I didn't. And in fact, I almost did the opposite. I was like, well, I was crying when the Brexit referendum result was announced, which is a bit pathetic, but, I did have a tear. And I'm a liberal and I worked for the BBC. And guess what? I'm a feminist. And, in a way, I used humor actually to kind of be like, oh, I'm a sort of, snowflake liberal but I'm not really a snowflake because I want to hear what you have to say about things. And it was a bit of an icebreaker with people. I can't see the point in pretending because actually that would be a more emotional labor in pretending. And these are not views that I feel comfortable pretending about, And to build rapport, there were parts of people's lives where I didn't need to pretend, where I could have some empathy with them, whether it's like they'd lived in a similar area or they had something in their background that was shared that I felt comfortable with, disclosing to them. And you do have to disclose, you do have to put something of yourself out there. You know, there are researchers and investigative journalists who obviously use deception. And I guess there is a place for it. If you want to put out the most shocking things that extremists say to one another in those closed groups, yes. But I did not have permission to deceive from my university. I was myself. I had, a different research phone. I had a different Facebook account. But sometimes I would send people a picture of my actual Facebook account so they could see that I was a real person as well. But I just didn't have the ethical approval. I didn't need to do it. I let people challenge me on my views. And a lot of them did want to challenge me on my views. It was just more trouble than it was worth. And so to deceive. And I just wouldn't have felt comfortable doing that. The utility of being more centrist. Now, there's certainly, there's a question around safety here as well. There is a utility in keeping some of your views to yourself where they are. If you were a trans person doing this research, I would say there would be a utility in keeping that to yourself if you could. There were certainly gay people, and there were actually people of color at some of these anti-Islam events. But, identity aspects that might make you more vulnerable, particularly when it was unpredictable. If you're in the pub with people, these are heavy drinkers. You might start the day with a group of people and they are sober, and then they are drinking and they become unpredictable. The dynamic changes, new people turn up. You suddenly go from feeling relatively comfortable to I'm not sure that I can leave easily. And I was in sometimes situations where I didn't know where I was because I'd got in a minibus and I'd given up my phone at the door of a meeting and I wasn't clear on where the tube station was from where I was. So in those situations, there is no utility in putting yourself further at risk. You're already, if you're not using deception, they know you're a researcher. They know you're at a university. They hate universities as liberal institutions and woke, etc. So, you need to be cautious about the degree of harm that you subjecting yourself to, and also cognizant of the fact that things change and you need to keep something back, withhold, use what is necessary to do your research ethically. And I would say be cautious about revealing much more.
Yeah, thank you, Liz, for this. And I would just add that I feel that at times it can be even more dangerous if you pretend to be something that you're not, because the truth might come out, or it will eventually when the
It will
publication
come
is
out.
out.
Yeah.
And I've even heard stories about researchers infiltrating a group, for instance, and then learning that they actually knew someone in the group, like a neighbor, like from 10 years ago or some that knew them and knew about
Yeah.
their views as well. So you get just stuck in that lie, and it's not very well safe for you first, and ethical as well if you're trying to build something to like sort of
Yeah.
relationship. It's an exchange, right? You
It's
give.
an exchange. It's not respectful of their position. It's not honest. It will come out, and they will feel, for the next researcher that they meet, if they meet one, you are changing the research space. You are changing their perceptions of who you are, and really kind of conforming to what they think, that you're out to get them, that you're there to trick them and deceive them. And in the words that was most often used, stitch them up. And that wasn't something that I wanted to do. I just didn't see, I take it as read what their views are, but I kind of felt like there's no way that they would read this book. The title, they were not going to like the title Extreme Britain, but they are, at least I would hope that they would read what their words back and feel like I treated them fairly, um, uh, if nothing else, because some of them actually treated me relatively fairly, and they felt, despite all of their kind of rhetoric, it was clear to me that many of them felt legitimized by meeting me and by not legitimized in terms of their far right views, but it was a kind of step towards maybe changing their views, that I would sit down and listen to them, because no one of my type, a white person with authority from an institution, had done that before. Their institutional experiences were negative, roundly speaking: school, police, the courts, social workers. They had round across the board negative experience of institutions and power. And so it was really important that their experience of me as a person of power um, was something that I felt, comfortable, proud of, really, actually, at the end of the day.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna move
It's
to
not a
the.
silly question. No.
Oh,
Sorry, it says it might sound silly, but it's not silly. It's not a silly
oh no.
question. No.
Oh no, absolutely not. It's a very important, serious question. The next question is, how do you handle or respond to accusations interviewees make against you, such as calling you a radical or tool of the radical left and so on?
Um, yeah, it's really hard. It depends on the where they're making those accusations, I think. I actually found I had more of that from the Islamists, because it was much harder to I mean, I was speaking to some of them online, and I got quite a lot of screenshotting from them online and them telling one another not to talk to me. Um, but I'd started off with them talking to Anjan Chowdhury first, and then I'd gone to his trial and I'd met his supporters in the public gallery. So that was how I sort of talked to them. Um, some, I mean, to be honest with you, some accusations, it was just better to ignore. Like, I still find I'm not vastly resilient. If someone is abusive to me, whether that's an accusation of being like a shill for the intelligence services, or like doing the government's bidding, which I had a bit of, or you're never going to listen to me. Nothing I say makes any difference. You've already decided what you're going to write. This kind of thing. It's not exactly abuse, but it's like, well, that's kind of, that's not the researcher that I am. Um, so it depends on the forum. If it was online and it was massive reputational damage, I might correct it in a post I made. I wouldn't engage with it directly. There was one case I did, but I thought it put me at risk, so I just had a brief message countering it. But mostly I would just think, well, I'll just leave them to it. It kind of goes without saying that I'm going to get some abuse here. And most of the abuse was private, actually. It was in text messages, or it was in face DMs, or it might be at a demo where I would make myself, put some distance. I'd just move on, move off, you know. But generally speaking, people's behavior in person was better than it was online. So I'm thankful. I think I didn't have to engage with far too much of that.
And just to add to this, because this happened to me only once, well, maybe more than once, but once that I really remember, I was trying to recruit a participant to interview him and take part in my study. So a far right, a right-wing extremist, and he accused me of being a feminist. So I did not deny this. I just say yes, I actually believe in gender equality, and I think that the fact that and this goes back to the previous question about deception, right? And lying about who you are and your views. I think that in this specific case, the fact that I did not deny this, or I did not lie and say, no, actually, I'm not a feminist. I'm like, this is what it convinced him to take part in the study. Seeing that I was sharing something with him, even though we disagree, we both disagree on each other's view, but we were able to listen to each other and to share those views. And that's the only question he asked me actually about that. Afterwards, he just agreed to take part in the study, and that was it. So sometimes, yeah, sometimes those accusations, you can actually embrace them depending on by whom they were made and in which context, as you said, Liz.
Yeah, I think the things that caused me the most stress and difficulty during the PhD was one person was I mean, apart from the whole thing, one person was charged with terrorism offences, and they thought it would be useful to say that they were my researcher and assistant. And then there was a kind of issue with them wanting the transcripts, which ultimately they didn't get. Of course, they were not my assistant. Um, and I appeared in media a couple of times. There was a documentary about the far right, and I was at a demo, and the camera lingered on me. And I was a bit annoyed because although, as I say, if you're at a demo, there's a fair chance people will think you're a far right supporter. If you're going to focus on someone with a video camera for more than 5 seconds, it might be good to chat to them to check who they are. Because as I say, I was always honest. Um, and then the incident with the brick, that was reported in the press, and somebody took a photograph of me with that far right person at the ambulance, I think it was, and it made me look like her friend. And I'm not her friend, so that put me at some risk because that was just a picture of me, and it put me at risk with the other group as well, with the Islamists, because it was important to me that everybody really respected that I was being truthful and that I wasn't. Again, I was dealing with two different groups of actors, so it was a little bit. That was an additional consideration here.
Hmm. The next question is by Cass Made. So asking, well, first, thank you so much for your presentation. Could you reflect on how you think your gender affected the interview process, the interview responses? So, for example, a female colleague who interviewed partly the same people as I did got very different answers, so much more personal, among other things.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because you are entering this masculinist space, and we know that the far right also, that this is very performative. People are performing for one another all the time, and they are performing probably the kind of what's the most hyper masculine violence as a status, aggression, abuse, gaining status. When you enter that space as a man, they're going to judge you according to their own norms and standards. So, that puts you in actually a very difficult position. Why would they trust you if you're not the kind of man? They would say to me anyway, if you're not good at violence and you don't like football, you're not a man that they're going to take seriously. So, to be anti-violence is, the absolute antithesis. You'd have to prove that maybe had been good at violence in the past. I don't know. Like that's the question for men. Um, it's hard for me to know what other types of answers I would have got, but I think there's two things. The first is that it was much easier to talk to men than it was to women because I was kind of a novelty for the men, and they were, interested in banter and being, sexually flirtatious. This is, kind of. They were also. I was just interested in kind of my personal situation. I guess, you'd get loads of kind of like really intrusive questions about whether you had kids, whether you've got a husband, what your husband think about things. So they're getting the sense of you, they're getting a feel for who you are within their own system of values. So who you are going into that space reveals a lot to them about the values. So the fact that a man might not get such personal responses shows what they expect, that they expect women to be caring and empathetic and that you're going to be able to talk about feelings with women. Whereas for them, they don't talk about feelings. The far right activism is the way that they express feelings. And those feelings are expressed in a particular, shouting abuse and Islamophobic abuse in the street, expressing anger, expressing care for native women and girls through this kind of repertoire of hostile, offensive activities, which is part of their cultural repertoire, they say, as being white working class people. So I did get more personal responses. I did get people saying, all right, I don't mind meeting you in the pub and sitting down and talking to you. But I did not get the women to speak to me because within that whole masculinist space in which there are fewer women, there's competition among the women for the men's attention, apparently. And when I'm in that space, they didn't really like that. And in fact, someone did say to me that they were going to wrap a bar stool around my head once when I was in the toilets with some people after a demonstration. And I took them fairly seriously about that. And that was perhaps most evident actually when I was talking to the Islamists, because I couldn't barely speak to any women at all. The men were total gatekeepers for the women. So, yeah, and of course, I'm talking to them about gender. So they're already like, I didn't use the word gender because no one would have known what that meant. But they all think, oh, that's about women, right? So you want me to talk to you about women? So there's also my questions were fairly non-confrontational and non-combative. I didn't, they're about personal things, and that fell within the repertoire of what they expect from chatting to me. And probably they didn't take me very seriously. I'm 5 foot tall. I'm not very threatening. I didn't get the impression they took me very seriously at all, and that's absolutely fine because and Audrey, you've written about this, obviously, that meant to some degree, if they don't see me as threatening, then I've got better access. They're sharing things with me, their feelings about they're falling out all the time in the group. Oh, so and so didn't say hello to me today at the demo. I'm really worried they didn't want me in the last video. These kinds of things they're telling me. And and then you find yourself kind of struggling with saying, oh, don't worry, I'm sure they like you really, which is kind of what you feel as a human being to say. But of course, so yes, it's a very different dynamic. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of women researchers who have a very similar experience to yours, Liz, especially in terms of talking to men extremists, that they will see the women researchers as apolitical, naive, or just a good listener. So that they really open up because of that, versus they're trying to keep like their face, their mask on, where they talk when they're talking to men, or they would assume that the men researcher know what they're talking about, like you know what I mean, whether they would explain everything to women because they're not sure whether they really understand what they mean. That's
Yeah.
yeah, that's some of the
Well,
experience I've heard from female versus male researcher in
yeah.
Germany.
And both are really good because they're just giving perspectives. Not no one of us has an objective truth about this. We're getting a picture based on who we are entering that space, and that picture tells us about the values of that space.
Okay, next question here. Focusing more on the Islamist part of your research. Even if these actors push back against their marginalization forming part of their experience, how did the fact that Muslim communities are targeted in very different ways by counterterrorism policies and practices inform your analysis? And any policy recommendations that either you deduce from it or others might do now that is out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it was a completely different experience, really, because I chose these two sets of actors because when I started off, I was aiming to look at cumulative extremism, reciprocal radicalization, and this idea that they're involved in this kind of spiral of activities with one another. But the research environment, the environment had changed because actually Chowdhury's group had been basically banned. Like they used to turn up at, far right demos and try and provoke conflict, and they'd essentially been banned from assembling in public so much. So there were issues there, and I had to sort of abandon that because it didn't really work. the reciprocal dynamics were much more between the far left and the far right, and also the police, a part or another actor in this, So the targeting, so the Islamists, I couldn't really ask the same questions at all because it was so heavily criminalized at this point in time. Islamic State was still existed, 2017, 2018, there was a lot of travel. People had had their passports taken away. Any support of Islamic State would have been, I would have had to report that to my supervisor and, to the police, basically. So I was prevented from asking sort of nitty-gritty questions. But as I say, most of my questions were not about what do you believe? Why do you support Islamic State? Or why do you support this? They were about, what was it like growing up? What was your school like? What were your relationships like? I'm talking around the activism, I'm talking to the activism, but the more kind of social aspects of that I can get something about gender from. So, I think that also helped, and that probably was part of the reason to Casmuta's question about, I'm asking more personal questions, essentially. They still go to the activism and radicalization. How did the fact that Muslim communities are targeted in very different ways? It's difficult, isn't it? Because, it doesn't matter. If someone says to me, well, my radicalization was nothing to do with Islamophobia and discrimination. Why are you putting white people at the center of my story again? Which is what one person did say. It's like, well, actually, when they're talking to me, they are telling me stories of discrimination and Islamophobia. So they do count, even if maybe they didn't want them to be. So, I'm not ceding the power of the narrative to them. I'm listening to their narrative, and then I will go away based on the literature, based on my own analysis and, percolating through and the different themes in different interviews. I'll make my own conclusions. And, very clearly, Islamophobia, grievances, discrimination were part of those stories because people were, they were all assimilated, but then they were censoring themselves and kind of censoring their own assimilation and, choosing one part of a hybrid identity. And part of that reason was because of experiences of grievances and Islamophobia. So, I listen to them telling me their perspectives, but I can, also write about that myself. Were there policy recommendations specific to that? I think, the whole book is about really recognizing the importance of masculinity and masculine status in radicalization and how that impacts in belonging, in grievances, in discrimination, in the cultures and norms, but also in about really situating the radicalization in wider society, because these groups of people are not, the sole repositories of Islamophobia. It's not just the far right that is racist or Islamophobic. So I was also looking at, how these are emerging from more mainstream contexts and really the inconsistencies and the tensions between the kinds of things they're espousing and their actual lives. People who men who have sole responsibility for their child, but think that women's place is in the home and that men are the breadwinners. And, so these inconsistencies were really important. And the book is really about kind of situating that radicalization and engaging. I mean, I don't know that my book has had any impact in a policy space. If there's any policymakers here who say it has, please let me know. But yes, I think that's probably as much as I'll answer that question. You've got 6 minutes left.
Next question is from Kat Williams, for saying, "Hi Liz, great talk. I just wanted to ask how or if you kept in contact with any of your participants in terms of conducting follow-up. I tried to conduct some follow-up interviews after my time in the field, but received very little response. And also, have any of your participants been in touch following the publication of the book?"
Yeah, it's a good question. And hello, Kat. So I obviously you're doing very similar work in a different context. So I only got in touch with I got in touch with two people. One was Jada Franson, and she was happy to talk to me again because she'd left Britain first by the time my book came out. So I wanted to talk to her about that. And she had her own motives and agenda because she had totally fallen out with Paul Golding, and she wanted to get into the book the stuff about domestic violence and assaults by him on her. And to be honest with you, although she was very clearly using me to do that, she had put that was on the record elsewhere, and it was relevant to discussion about misogyny in these groups and the role of misogyny both outwards towards the out group and inwards towards the in group. And another thing the book does is gender the definition of extremism that J.M. Berger offers in his book, Extremism. Um, so she had a reason to talk to me. I reached out to someone else and they were like, why should I talk to you? What do I get out of it? And I'm like, yeah, you're kind of right. You don't really get anything out of it. And so she was like, yeah, exactly. So I'm not going to talk to you again. Now, I did have a stipulation that I would delete contacts, which I think, as a researcher, you're very loath to do. But I did basically delete because I got for my research the worst, most basic phone on the market. My contacts were stored in there. Some people, I didn't know their names. I didn't want to know their names. And I let that phone die into obsolescence. So I could not retrieve those numbers if I wanted to. And there were times where I was like, oh, how do I retrieve those? But I can't. They're gone. And that's fine because that was stipulated in my ethical approval. But so I'm pretty sure had I reached out to more people, I'd have found exactly the same response. And particularly now the book's out and it's called Extreme Britain, and I'd be nervous. I'd be nervous of someone like Tommy Robinson, instigating a pylon of some kind. If I were to do the research again, I would probably start from scratch again. But I'd have to be honest about the book, and I don't know whether anyone would talk to me with a book called Extreme Britain, quite frankly.
Yeah, I feel like we always have like this moment where you're new in research, for instance, you haven't published too much on the topic where people want to talk to you because they cannot find many things on you. But then the most you get known, most you publish on this topic, the more people might be a bit reluctant to do anything.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So, and Kat, I'm looking forward to reading your book when it comes out on doing this work in a German context too. So thanks for that question.
I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to combine two in case you're able to touch the two of them at the same time, but we only have 3 minutes left. So the first question, asking, how do you avoid legitimization of extreme views while also representing their truth? Is it the same for both sides of the extremist world, like far right and Islamist? And the other question is, what effect do you think the increasing culture of mainstreaming far right narratives is going to have on your research? So feel free to answer the question you want as we only have a few minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if it is the same. My ethics was kind of like you sort of they treated both sets of actors as this, it's like why would you have one different set of rules for each set of actors? So there, as I say, I did have some specific restrictions on the kinds of things I could ask the Islamists because of the risk of criminalization. I had very different feelings for both sets of actors. I had much more guilt and shame around the far right actors because you do identify with them. You do feel like, especially when you're at a demo and you're worried people will think that you're one of them. So I had very different feelings. And, part of that is also around that kind of stigmatization of the far right in a different way to how jihadists are stigmatized. And I'm sure if I'd come from a Muslim community talking to the jihadists, that would have been something that would have been parallel. So do I think they should have the same treatment? Broadly speaking, I guess I do in terms of whether we should be interviewing them, because I do think that it's not the whole story. We can look at data online, we can look at manifestos, we could rely on the deception that investigative journalists who very bravely put themselves at risk to get that data, and then we can see what people tell us, when we've tried to build a relationship of trust with them, and you get the whole picture from all of these things, together. The second part of the question, sorry, I know it's only 1 minute. I've forgotten already, Audrey. Sorry.
It's okay. You can keep on. It's okay. I won't shut you down.
Um, it's about mainstreaming. Yes, sorry, I've just seen it. Yeah, it's really difficult because I think the pressure on researchers not to talk will be greater. And actually, I think it is more necessary than ever because part of the issue here is the division, the polarization. But we do this with the understanding that there's not going to be empathy for us from them. And this might not be the long-term tactic. At some point, there might have to be a change, but so far, and it depends on the country as well. So there are provisos there and caveats, but broadly speaking, I still do believe in the importance of dialogue, essentially. And maybe I'm an optimist and naive and an idealist, but I still do cling to that belief.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth Pearsons. That's all the time we had today. And thank you for being so generous and sharing so much with us. I think that everyone learned a lot. So please do not miss the next webinar on November 20. I'm still waiting for the confirmation from the speaker, but the webinar should focus on research trauma. So make sure to join us November 20th on Zoom, as always. Thank you once again. Thank you very much, Elizabeth
Oh,
Pearsons.
thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for the brilliant questions from everyone. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. I hope they're useful. Hope I was useful.
Absolutely, 100%. Thank you so much. Bye
Thank
bye.
you. Bye bye. Bye bye, everyone. And Tommy Robinson kind of memorably said, "Oh, well, I don't think I can talk to you about that because it's like I've got my wife to think about." And I sort of laughed and was like, "That's not really what I meant. That's not at all what I meant." Um,